We have a question about the VAT draft law, when it will be available, and when it's expected to come into action.
Okay, VAT. We already have a partial implementation of the VAT. So we're going to complete on this and have a fully fledged system. It is not only the VAT that I'm targeting, but equally important, I'm targeting to ease and simplify the procedures of the sales tax system. This is the key reform that I'm targeting. And as part of this, I always had a proposal, even before my ministerial position, that we should abolish all the procedural articles of the sales tax code, refer all of them to the already well-established procedural articles in the income tax, with the exception of the very few articles that relate to the typical nature of the sales tax system. This is the true unification of the Egyptian Tax Authority. That's one. Two, it will ease the lives of the accountants, of the business community, and of my people in the tax authority. And three, it will reduce the amount of disputes and remove all the unfairness in some of the penalties that are already stated in the current sales tax system. That's not all. We're going to unify the tax rate with the exception of automobiles, so not to have any high expectations. Keep your cars. We are going to broaden the coverage, but we also are going to implement the VAT to the services sector, which means we will allow for tax deductions as well. Time frame, I had a technical mission from the IMF to do me a gap analysis. We can implement on phases if we like to, or we can wait until early next week when the authority and the systems and the infrastructure and the entire IT system is ready to go. We're still thinking about it, but it's coming soon.
Thank you, Your Excellency. We'll go through quickly. You mentioned your speech about the right way to do the reform, and can you just explain it a little bit, the right way to do the reform? And I have another question about the EGPC backlog payment for oil companies, and the question about is it possible to net this backlog with due taxes? Thank you, Excellency.
The right way for reforms, anything we do is the right way. Just take it for granted. No, honestly, we're not reinventing the wheel in anything that we intend to do. So we're only going to be implementing the best and most conventional work practices. For example, let me leak a little reform to you. Harmful tax avoidance, for example. Tax avoidance is legal. We welcome it. We don't like it, but I have to say that we welcome it, just to appear that we are reasonable. But it makes us lose money. Some of those tax avoidance practices are harmful. And we looked into the OECD and other conventional practices in order to give the authority the upper hand to prevent the tax avoidance, not to interfere in the investment decision, but not to use an investment decision to avoid the tax, which belongs to 90 million people on my back. And this is one of the things. We're not going to do it homemade recipe, no. We're discussing, we're going to be consulting many of you in this room and outside of this room and make sure that whatever we implement is the way it should be. But again, if you see anything that you haven't heard about outside in the rest of the world, just be assured that this is the right way as long as we do it. On the backlog, let me first commend the Central Bank of Egypt that since the political transition started in 2011, whether it was Governor Al-Uqda or currently, at that time, or currently Governor Ramez, the two of them refused to implement or to impose any capital controls in the system. The only capital control or capital restriction, I would say, was on Egyptian individuals, and this is for understandable reasons. But a conventional capital control never happened. It was a very risky decision. I'm sure they had brave hearts, and they continue to do it. But this is an economy that has been undergoing a political transition, and in many times, very tough, I repeat, very tough political polarization for 3 years. What do you expect? A little queue here and there? Bear with us. Again, this is part of the burden sharing. This is part of going together on a long lifetime journey. We understand that it is causing a lot of pressures on those companies that are having the queues, not only in the petroleum sector, but also some investors in the capital market have a little queue. Again, relative to the huge circumstances that this country is undergoing, I think you can hold up your breath for a little while and bear with us. And we appreciate this.
Just that, Your Excellency, netting against taxes, is that an option?
Sorry?
Netting the backlog against taxes.
No, a tax is a tax.
Okay. Tariq, I get 2 questions now, okay? First of all, if you charged by the question, you could have probably reduced the deficit, but shows all the interest. And I think maybe, Hisham, maybe we can look at asking some of these other questions later to your office and you can respond. We can put them in the magazine or whatever, because I think everybody, there's a lot of questions here and we won't have time for all the answers. Previous administrations' decisions to reduce the tax rates achieved a remarkable success and growth rates even with a global turndown. Are you looking at anything to maintain the same policy? Instead of talking about tax increases, should we be talking about tax reductions to stimulate the economy? And a lot of questions along that line.
How can I start answering your question? Well, yes. Typically, we should be looking at reducing taxes. But I will not start to do this unless I have an appropriate and a sufficient tax base that is buoyant and well linked to the GDP. What I mentioned to you, that our tax revenues as a percent of GDP is 8%. If I add the EGPC and the other sovereigns, it goes up to 15%. But this is something as if it's from my own left pocket to my right pocket. But I'm talking about the tax production. The tax base is very thin, is very narrow. And as a percent of GDP, the tax efficacy, it is on a declining trend. That 8-9% 6-7 years ago was higher than 10%, a little bit higher, still low. In the MENA region, this rate is the average tax ratio as a percent of GDP is around 27%. I need to fix my tax system, make sure that I have a good deal of an authority that can take care of the new systems, have appropriate information, because we are suffering in our tax system of a problem of asymmetric information, and this is costing the entire society a lot. This will not take us too long, and then we will put the taxes on a declining trend. But it was many people in this room and outside this room that requested to have an exceptional temporary tax of 5% on the rich. As an economist, I did not see it exactly the best time to implement it. But as a government official who saw the intention and intuition behind that tax, especially that we will allow the taxpayers to choose particular services projects to direct their taxes to. So if you want to build a hospital, for example, in a certain village, you can use that extra wedge of 5% of a list, out of a list that we will be putting on the websites of the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Planning and International Cooperation, and you can say, I want to direct my tax to serve that village in that particular project. So there is sort of a social content. I know this is not pure and typical economics, but this happened in Germany after the unification, and they had this tax for 3 years. They extended it for another 10 years. We do not intend to do so. Only 3 years, and it's going to be embedded in the law.
Just answered about half of these questions on that one. A lot of questions here on subsidies. I guess the big question is not if, but when. And is it going to be, it always gets delayed? A lot of people in the room know what the problems are. Obviously, you know more than all of us. But the when question. When are the subsidies going to be cut? Where are you going to start? What's the framework for that?
No answers about when. Very clearly. But it's coming soon. Very soon.
Okay.
I have a few questions about actually suggestions for.
A few
Are we going to
suggestions.
answer all these questions here and there, or?
Yes,
or-
$10 per
Yes?
question, sir.
Okay.
I have one question about U.S. dollar Egyptian pound exchange rate. Any expectation for devaluation? Is it good for the economy?
Well, the central bank is managing the monetary policy in the best way, I think, that can maneuver these tough circumstances.
One more question about changing the balance sheet, country balance sheet from cash to accrual.
From cash to accrual?
Yes.
No, not in this stage.
A number of countries apply a tax on vacant flats and houses. Is there any plan to do this in Egypt?
On houses, we already have it. We have a property tax that has been approved by the very first cabinet meeting that I attended in last March. It is awaiting the ratification of the president, and we're going to be implementing starting early July. And it's going to include all the properties in the country.
What is your plan to formalize the economy, as in getting more people into the tax base?
Well, formalizing the economy in the first place is not a target for the tax umbrella. It is a target to have better management of the entire economy as a whole from a macro perspective. This, by definition, will have its positive implications on taxes. But I do not want the small producers to fear joining the formal economy because of the taxes. We're going to be working on simplifying the tax systems more and more for those small ones, the registration issues, the licensing issues, in order to help and encourage those small ones in the informal economy to join the formal economy. But it is not a target that I get taxes from them. This will come on its own.
Sorry, one last.
I have a technical question here, and excuse my ignorance, about canceling the law F102 for 2012. Is it an option? Is it going to be canceled?
102, that's the sales tax thing?
Yes.
We're still looking into it. It is suspended, by the way, so far, and it was never implemented. So we're still looking into it, whether we can have that implementation of the VAT on phases, and we can see what needs to be changed in the law 102, and we change it, or we can keep it suspended the way it is now until we have a fully fledged VAT code, maybe by early next week or early next year or so.
I think there's a broad spectrum of questions, and we won't go into it on simplifying taxes. There's a lot of taxes
Yes.
out there. Again, I think you've already addressed that. Any thought, though, on taxes on the stock market, as in capital gains, dividend distributions?
Well, our target is to broaden the tax base to capture all the types and kinds of incomes and activities that do not address the poor, as I just mentioned. And everything is possible. Nothing is excluded. And we're looking into it.
Your Excellency, I have a question about the Egypt informal sector and how this will affect the country GDP. Any plans for your ministry to approach this sector with taxes?
No, again, it's the same thing. I'm not approaching the informal sector with the target to bring them under the tax umbrella. I want them to bring them first under the formal economic umbrella, to be productive, to see them, to develop them, to help them, and by definition, when they grow, they will be paying the taxes.